Welcome to Thinking in Code, Building a Button, Part 2. In the first part, we designed the look of the button. In this part, we're going to make it functional, which means mousing over it, it'll change color, and then when we click on it, it'll do something. First things first, I'm going to go ahead and launch our app. We're going to see what we built last time. Sure enough, there's our button. And when I move my mouse over it, it doesn't do anything, which does not feel good for a button. We want it to feel interactive and alive. I grabbed an image from Google again to show what an old button would look like without our mouse over versus a button with our mouse over, and kind of the difference between the two. I'm also going to be using this image to steal colors from. Yep, so here's our blue. This is the color that we're going to want to change. I'm going to say var color1 equals make color RGB. RGB stands for red, green, blue, so we're going to need 3 values to insert in this function. I'm going to steal the blue from the not mouse over. Sure enough, here's our R, G, and B values. So now I'm just going to work silently, kind of grabbing these colors and popping them in. I'll go back and forth just to make sure I'm grabbing the right ones. Going to be doing the same thing for the second color, color2, and the same function, make color RGB. The difference here is that I'm going to be grabbing the RGB values from the darker of the buttons, the one that we want to be when our mouse is over. I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm thinking I'm going to change the name of the variables here. Color 1 and color 2 could be confusing, so I'm going to change color 1 to color normal, and then color 2 I'm going to change to color hover. That way I know which one is the button normally and which one is the button when our mouse is over it. And now we're going to get started with our logic for the mouse over. So this is going to be the first ever if statement that we've written. We're going to write if, and then the function is point in rectangle. And we see there's a bunch of variables that we're going to need. We need the px, the py, and then we need the x1, the y1, the x2, and the y2. The x1, the y1, the x2, and the y2 should be similar because we use that to make the rectangle for our button. Meanwhile, the px and the py, those are actually the point that we're looking for to be inside of the rectangle, which in this case would be our mouse x and our mouse y. And then as for the x1, the y1, the x2, and the y2, we already have those, so we'll just copy them from our draw round rect, and then we'll paste them in. So remember, this is just the x1, the y1, the x2, and the y2, and we already had them, so we didn't need to retype. Then we'll post an open brace, and then we'll type a closed brace 2 lines below. And that way, I always type, or I always make my open brace and my closed brace right away, that way I don't forget. And then I do like to space things out as well, so I have more room to type, but don't necessarily need to. And we're going to say draw set color, and this is for the color hover, since this code is only ran when our mouse is over it. And then I'm also going to write an else statement real quick, and I'm going to capture in the other draw set color, which is going to be when our mouse is not over. So now I am going to go ahead and I'm going to hop into Photoshop and kind of draw out like a little diagram of an if statement, specifically an if-else statement. So if a thing happens, right, and then we also have else if the other thing happens, right? And both of these things can't happen at the same time. It's an if-else, right? If the if doesn't happen, then the else happens. And if the else happens, then the if obviously wasn't happening. And we can visualize it like a fork in the road, essentially, right? The road, you have one path ahead of you, and then it branches into point 1 and point 2. And 1 and 2 can't happen at the same time. And then we can visualize that here with our point and rectangle and then our else. So I'm going to comment out the point and rectangle with mouse over button, and then I'm going to comment out the else with mouse is not over the button. And then let's go ahead and run the program, and we should see that our button is now going to change color based on if our mouse is or isn't over it. And sure enough, would you look at that? It's light, and then we move our mouse over it, and it turns to the darker blue. Perfect. So now the next thing we're going to be doing is setting it up so we can actually click on this button and have it do something. Gonna go ahead and get started with the code to actually click the button. We're gonna write this inside of the if point and rectangle braces and underneath the draw set color. We're writing it inside of the braces here because we only want the left click to happen if our mouse is inside of the button. We obviously don't want to click not in the button and have, the button be clicked. That wouldn't be good. And we're going to go ahead and get started writing our if statement for the left click. The function is going to be mouse check button pressed because we only want to happen when we click the mouse button. And then the variable that we insert is mb_left, stands for mouse button left. We're going to do an open and a close brace, and then we type one function inside of our left click, which is show message. And I'm just going to type in it works for fun. Okay, let's go ahead and run the program now. Sure enough, we click on the button, and it works. We get a message that pops up. Back inside of GameMaker, I'm going to comment out our clicking area. I'm going to say clicking on the button. And then I am going to get rid of the show message, and I'm just going to leave the clicking area open for the future when we decide to make this button do something, real. Now I'm going to pose a fun little challenge to us, right? Let's say that we want to have a second button on screen. We already have the one button working, right, in terms of mouse over and clicking on it. But what do we do if we want to have a second button, say maybe right next to the first button? What would be the most simple and elegant solution for us to get that? If your first thought jumped to copying everything and then pasting it underneath, that certainly works and that would get us a second button. But no, let's not do that. That is extremely inefficient way to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called a function. I'm going to walk through that. First thing we're going to do is we're going to add an event, specifically the create event. I'm going to clear out all the code as well. And I'm going to write the word function, since that is how we start writing a function. For the function name, I think I'm going to name it button draw. You can name it certainly whatever you want. This is just, I figure it's a good name. And in terms of what goes inside of the function, it's going to be everything that we wrote that makes up our button. So we're going to select everything, we're going to Control-C copy it, and then I'm going to go ahead and paste it into the function. I will need to fix the indentation afterwards, but here we go. We have our button and everything that makes the button work. However, we do need arguments. Functions have arguments, but the arguments are the variables at the top: the x, the y, the width, the height, and the text. So I'm just going to write those in. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to comment out our variables. We don't need those anymore. However, I do need to know what the actual math and the numbers are. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete the old draw that we had, the old button, since we don't need it anymore. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete that as well. And then I'm going to write our function, button draw. And then I'll do the argument parentheses. And I'm going to take the numbers that we still have from the create, and I'm going to fill those in as our arguments. And button, there we go. And then let's go ahead, we're going to run it, and we should have the exact same thing we had before. And we do. We have the one button, but the amount of code in the draw is now only one line. It is much simpler. And then I'm going to go ahead and clean up the commented code. I'm going to remove the spacing from up here, and there we go. We have a very clean and nice and neat function. And this contains all the button code we had. We can even collapse it if we want to. Functions are just really, really nice to use to compartmentalize our logic. And then we'll go ahead and we're going to make the second button now. So I'm going to write the same function, button draw. The only thing that's going to be different, since I want it to the right, is I'm going to need a larger x value. Otherwise, everything else I can put the exact same as the other button, including the text of button. I'll put a 2 at the end just to differentiate. And then let's launch this. Oh, okay, so we do have two buttons, but they're overlapping. I'm going to increase the X just a little bit. I'm going to bring it up to 400, and then I'll launch it again. And there we go. Look at that. We got the two buttons right next to each other. Perfect. And all it took was just 2 lines of code and draw instead of copying and pasting the huge block. Functions, they're very handy and very nice to use. So we've solved the first part of the problem with having 2 buttons, which is, well, having 2 buttons. But in terms of the functionality of the button, right, like you click on it and it does something, how do we branch that logic? We only have one if mouse check button press, right? And if I put it to show message, I'll just say, I guess, the word message, right? I'll demonstrate here kind of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to launch the program. And we click on button 1, it says message. Click on button 2, it also says message. So sure, we have 2 buttons on screen, but in terms of clicking on them, they do the exact same thing. So somehow we're going to need to be able to branch our logic even though the logic is contained in one spot for both buttons. And that's going to have to do with returning a value. So returning a value is a concept that has to do with kind of what they call a subroutine almost, where I'm going to draw this box here and I'm going to make this box the kind of visual representation of our draw event. So I'm just going to quickly grab the letter T, I'm going to write draw, there we are. And then inside of the event, I am going to write the two lines that we have, which is our button draw functions, the two buttons that we made. And I'm going to make a second one as well. And then I'm going to draw, so this function, right, is, it's one line, but inside of that one line is the entire function code that we have. So I'm going to make a second box, and I'm going to label it the button draw function. And inside of the button draw function is going to be basically all of our code, right? We got lines and lines of all the different code that makes the button work, yada yada. But at the end of it, we're going to have the return. And what it's going to do is it's going to basically spit out whether or not we clicked on the button or we didn't click on the button. So I'm going to write return clicked. And then the return will return it back into the draw event so that we can branch, just like if you remember our if statement, how the logic branched if else, we're going to be able to branch based on whether or not the button was clicked on in that frame. Alright, back inside of GameMaker, we can go ahead and get started on getting in the clicked and return functionality. So var clicked equals false, every frame clicked is going to start on false, and then only when we actually do a left click is clicked going to be equal to true. Now I almost messed up here and I almost put a return right underneath clicked equals true, when return really should be at the end of the entire kind of function statement. Now it wouldn't be wrong necessarily to put it back up with the clicked equals true. All it would mean is that everything after the return wouldn't get read by the computer when we clicked in that frame. So clicked equals false to start, clicked equals true when we left click, and then every frame returned that clicked, whether or not clicked is false or clicked is true. Now back inside of the draw though, we are going to need to actually store what is being returned from the button draw. So we're going to say var clicked equals button draw, and then right underneath I'm going to say if clicked, we're going to say show message, and then I'll write message 1 so we can differentiate. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for the second button, var clicked equals button draw, if clicked, and then we're going to say show message 2. And then, so what this means is that, if we're clicking on a button, we should now have two different things happening based on each button. So message 1 and message 2. So we got it. Now each button is, they run from the same function, but based on whether or not they're being clicked, they can do different things. And so with that, we have two different buttons. And that completes the building a button part 1 and part 2 tutorial. If you guys found it helpful at all, remember to like, subscribe, and if you want to stay up to date with anything that I'm doing, you could follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @PureNukage.